and welcome to Fast Talk, your source for the science of endurance performance. I'm your host, Rob Pickels, with my usual partner in crime, Trevor Connor, but also someone special, Grant Holicky. How special is Grant? So special that we've decided to make him a regularly recurring special guest. Today, we discuss our culture of believing more is better. If a little bit of something is good for you, then a lot is great. Or, as I like to say, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. Often, this thought process is applied to training. If a little bit of high-intensity training makes us strong, then doing it every day will make us unstoppable. In today's episode, we're going to dispel this more is better philosophy and talk about why it's actually in opposition to how our physiology works, and most importantly, how we adapt. At the very core of physiology is a principle called homeostasis, which describes how our bodies are always trying to maintain equilibrium or balance. The classic example is body temperature. Our body typically works to maintain a core temperature of around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, despite our environment, clothing, and activity. But it's not easy for our bodies to maintain this equilibrium. The body has to work hard to maintain that consistent temperature. Think of homeostasis as a scale that's under constant stress that tips it one way and then the other. Our body constantly responds to those tips, working to get the scale back into balance and never letting it tip so far that it falls over. That is the essence of homeostasis. When we train, we are essentially playing with that scale. Tip it an appropriate amount and the body will adapt to restore homeostasis. Stress it too far, and the body can't restore the balance, falling into overtraining. This is why more is better is often counterproductive when it comes to training. Effective training is instead a carefully timed game of playing with that homeostatic balance. Since this is a summary episode, we're going to include clips from several past episodes of world-class athletes, coaches, and physiologists talking about balance, timing, and adaptation. Those include Brent Bookwalter, Joe Friel, Sepp Kuss, Dr. Inigo San Milan, George Bennett, Ruth Winder, Tim Cusick, Larry Warbass, and Dr. Steven Seiler. So, plant your feet, hold on, and let's make you fast.
Listeners, we are listening to you. We have lowered the price of membership by 75%. Now you can get all your training science, workouts of the month, guides to sports nutrition, articles, and workshops for just $60 per year. Join today at fasttalklabs.com/join. Well, welcome back to another episode of Fast Talk. This is one of my favorite types of episodes, and this is going to be a little bit different because typically it has been Chris just asking me questions. Now we've got three of us, and all of us can actually talk to this subject. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be different. But this is one of our summary episodes. So we are about to talk about a whole bunch of stuff you've heard before. As a matter of fact, we're pulling in a bunch of clips from past episodes. But this is really diving into a theme or a message that we feel has something we've been trying to communicate, and just want to take an episode and really dive into it and hit this particular theme. So our theme for today is talking about the importance of balance and timing. And we're going to take a little bit of a different approach to it. So hopefully this is going to be fun. Let's start by talking about the opposite of balance, which is something that is pretty big in our culture, particularly big in training. And I'm looking at Grant kind of nodding his head going, yep. This whole concept of more is better.
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, a lot of our sport is built around this mentality of more is better. And especially when, I guess I can speak to all of us in this room, when we grew up, there was a time frame where more was incredibly better. In the 80s and 90s, this is how we dealt with training and cycling. This is how we dealt with training, swimming, running, everything. We just threw more at people, saw what they could handle, and who was left was fast. And everybody else might have been broken.
A little self-selection on that one, yeah. Right? Yeah, find the responders there. Grant, it's funny, when you said us growing up in the 80s and the 90s, more is better, My immediately mind went to candy. Actually, it was funny. I was really surprised when you went with training.
Yeah.
But a lot of people do have this mindset that anything that's worth doing is worth overdoing, right?
Or underdoing, right? I mean, you can still go back to that time frame and say, okay, eliminate all the fat from your diet, eliminate all the this from your diet, eliminate all the that from your diet. And so the same thing comes into training. Like, you can't eliminate everything and you can't get rid of everything. Kind of that middle ground of everything.
Yeah, but I'm going to put the Connor nutritionist aside.
Pump the
and
brakes.
when we are talking about candy, more is always better. More
Swedish
is
fish.
always better. If you are on the couch having a heart attack with a headache,
More
you can
candy?
still have more.
Just eat
All
more
right,
candy.
fair. I think that works. That works for me.
It'll end the problem sooner.
Do I actually have to put a disclaimer on that?
Yeah.
That's up to you, not me.
So let's actually start right here with one of our first clips. This is Brent Bookwalter from episode 175 talking about it's about balance. And he actually addresses this fact that more is not necessarily better. So let's hear from him now.
As much as cycling is a sport where your hard work and your commitment and the amount you push yourself and the amount you do does yield benefit, without a doubt, there's a point when it goes the other way and actually starts to hurt you. Some ways it is a little bit of a no pain, no gain sport because you're not going to get better out just by sitting on your couch, or you're not going to get better just by doing easy rides all the time. But just as much, it's a sport of moderation and knowing when to say when. It isn't just about the more you can do, the better you'll be. Otherwise, I don't think it would be as unique and as beautiful of a sport. And each person ultimately, regardless of the coaches you have or the support network you have, ultimately, it's your responsibility to figure out how all those pieces come together and what's going to make you your best.
So I actually want to take a bit of a different approach of explaining why this concept of more is better is actually a bad idea in training. And to me, this gets at pretty much the fundamental principle of physiology, which is homeostasis. So homeostasis is this idea that our bodies try to keep most things in a tight range, a tight balance. So it tries to regulate a particular body temperature. It doesn't like going too far above, doesn't like going too far below. It tries to keep your different levels, sodium, potassium, all your different electrolytes at a particular level. You can talk about almost anything in the body, and the body likes to keep this particular level. And it can be pushed one way or the other, but your body's always going to try to get back to what's called homeostasis. So, Rob, you had a really interesting way of describing this when we were talking about this episode, which is thinking about it like a scale.
Yeah, Trevor, it's very much a balance. It's kind of like a scale that could be tipping sort of back and forth, right? And what people don't necessarily always remember is how actively the body is maintaining this homeostasis. I think that we all assume that it's just this natural thing that sort of happens. Oh, I eat too much sodium, then I pee out a little bit of extra. It's a very natural thing. But really, it takes a lot of energy because the body is actively trying to maintain this balance that we're talking about.
So when you look at more is better in the context of homeostasis, that concept is almost the antithesis of homeostasis, because it's basically saying we're not trying to keep balance at all. We're trying to just tip that scale more and more and more and more. And the issue is, at some point, if it's too much, the homeostasis is going to break.
Right. And I think one of the things that gets dangerous about this is remember that there's something to do with homeostasis that keeps us in line, right? So as we load, we may feel good under load. There's a reason in the fourth day of a stage race, people put out all-time power numbers. They're in that groove and they're rolling and everything feels good. That's part of the body freaking out, trying to hold everything in line. But that scale is getting a little heavier and a little heavier on that one side, and you never know when that next piece tips the scales completely.
Well, I think that the problem that happens, right, is the body realizes, and we're doing an anthropomorphism in some regard here, right? I don't know if it realizes per se, but the body realizes that, hey, you know what? The load and the stress, it's just going up and it's going up and it's going up. And there is no way that I'm going to be able to actively pull this back. So what does the body do? It begins to shut things down. Right? Your max heart rate comes down. You begin limiting your workload. Your carbohydrates don't get depleted. You can't do the workloads or the volume or anything anymore that keeps pushing you out of balance like this. It's proactively preventing you from overloading. But when you get to that point, you're pretty deep there.
Yeah. And you didn't know it. And that's one of the things that's important for us to talk about. You probably don't know it until it's too late.
And this is probably a really good place. We have a great quote from Dr. Inigo Samalan. This is from episode 205, where he talks about what happens when you're putting too much of this stress on your body, that it causes this release of cortisol and can lead to inflammation. And that's getting out of homeostasis. That's the effect of trying to do too much. So let's hear from him now.
Yeah, so that's a great point too. So one of the things is like, that you might have some hormonal imbalances, right? So and disruptions. So for example, the precursor, right, of proteolysis, which is protein breakdown, is cortisol. So this is one of the parameters of biomarkers that we see in athletes who have very high levels of cortisol. It's a hormone that responds to both psychological and physiological stress. So when an athlete is not mentally stressed, but you see very high levels of cortisol, that athlete is breaking down more protein than normal probably. And then you look at the anabolic side of it, which is testosterone. So you look at the ratio, and many times you see athletes with very low testosterone levels because they have to keep replenishing the catabolic effects, right, of cortisol and lack of energy while training. So that's where you start getting that catabolic profile of the athletes. And that takes them to a different layer, which is more inflammation, right? So the inflammation that we see is when you have muscle breakdown, you end up with muscle micro tears and muscle damage. Not saying it's an injury, right? But you can see muscle damage. And there are multiple research studies on these, right, for decades with muscle biopsies looking at disruptions in the muscle structure. But we can see this in blood analysis and biomarkers. And the thing is, too, is that the physiological mechanism to repair, or one of the physiological mechanisms to repair muscles is inflammation. How many times I've seen a blood analysis and someone's cortisol levels are off the chart, right? And obviously the first thing is, oh my God, you're training too much, right? And then you start seeing like, no, actually this person is not training more than 5 hours a week or so. But then you see like, whoa, that person is going through enormous mental stress, or maybe some events, right? They're going through some drama, or some, dramatic situation in their lives, or stressful. Like, yeah, sure, that alone, is going to get cortisol off the chart, and it's going to interfere with recovery, with the anabolic catabolic balance, right? And therefore, yeah, you have a lot more chances to become overtraining.
So here's what's important. What we are ultimately trying to do here is adapt. So adapt means your body responds to the training by getting fitter, getting stronger, taking whatever you throw at it and say, I'm now going to make you a better athlete. That's adaptation. And I do think sometimes we don't quite understand what adaptation is, what it means.
Yeah. So, if we go back to that homeostasis principle, you add a little extra challenge onto the body, right? Maybe you spend some time climbing up a hill and it's hard. Your body doesn't necessarily like that. You do it once and nothing really changes, right? Because your body has no reason to change. But you go out and you do those workouts in a fairly consistent manner and your body says, hey, this is the new norm. I better adapt because I don't want to be out of balance. So you make the physiological changes that you have to. Maybe it's more mitochondria or something else. But that is, again, part of the balance because you need to do that in the appropriate way, right? Where enough stimulus for change is worthwhile and the body is able to, quote unquote, adapt to that and make that the new norm, make that the new balance.
Right. And every time we're loading the body, right, we load it in different ways. We can load it with volume. We can load it with stress. And how do we layer those things to make sure that we're loading enough, but at the same time, not overloading, right? And so we come back to this idea of how does then recovery fit in? How do we use recovery in order to adapt? Recovery itself is not adaptation. Recovery is a way to help the body adapt.
Yeah, Grant, actually really glad that you brought that up because I think sometimes people do actually mistake the concept of adaptation and recovery. So let's actually throw in right here, this is from episode 82, a conversation we had with Joe Friel where he talked about, he has a whole chapter in his book explaining that adaptation and recovery are not the same thing.
Late in the book, I talk about, I actually kind of throw in a curveball there. based on what we just talked about. And that was the discussion about recovery versus adaptation, in that they're not the same thing. And that sometimes it's better for an athlete to be very open-ended about the recovery process, which now being taken to mean to include adaptation. And sometimes plans don't do that. Sometimes athletes don't know how they're going to feel when they get to a certain point in the season. They haven't experienced what they're planning to do. And when they get there, they discover the load is much greater than they thought it was going to be. Now, what do? Do they continue on? Do they press ahead with the same plan, or do they make changes to it because of what they're experiencing? And my point in that later chapter where I talk about recovery and adaptation is that the most important thing is adaptation. It's not recovery. The most important thing is adaptation. That's the reason why we train, is to adapt. If you didn't adapt, what the hell would be the reason for going out there and doing workouts? And to explain that, for example, the difference between a recovery and adaptation, there's lots of research showing that hot and cold alternating immersions, or baths, speed up recovery. There's not a single research study that shows it speeds up adaptation. So you may feel like you're recovered because you've done certain things. You've got a massage, or you've done all these things that we all know about, but that doesn't mean you're adapted. Your body, we don't know right now, we don't know of any way to speed up the adaptive process. It's a biological phenomenon, which is really beyond what we know about sports science right now, but it's at the heart of what we're talking about here. And so the issue is that you've got to be able to differentiate these two terms, recovery and adaptation, and not be focused just on recovery, but also realize you've got to give your body a chance to adapt. And so what does that mean? Well, that means especially sleep, which is when hormones kick in and the body actually goes through the process of becoming stronger, if you will. And so even though I've talked about having a plan, I'm now toward the end of the book talking about how you've got to be ready to deviate from that plan because of the need to adapt as opposed to simply recover. So I tried to sneak that in toward the end because I wanted the athlete, the reader, to understand that all these other things are important, but this now becomes one of the most important things. You have to also give consideration to how are you adapting.
So let's talk a little bit more about damage, quote unquote damage, what we're doing to the body when we're training. So when we're loading, right? This is what we're talking about when we're doing damage. And so you can do a ton of volume, and that's going to do damage, like I said, or you can do a ton of intensity, and that's going to cause damage. But this idea as damage as a good thing is probably something we want to dive into a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think that the word damage, even though it's a common thing for people to say, we really need to understand what that is, right? Because I think that damage suggests maybe something more severe than what the body actually needs. You know, if you think about it, ultimately what we need is stress. And maybe the load, the mechanical load that you're having causes little micro tears in the muscle. Maybe it depletes your carbohydrate, right? But it puts the body ultimately in a compromised situation. And that's really the quote unquote damage that we're talking about here. If we go too deep on the damage, then we're talking about something that's completely different.
And I think, again, going back to this whole concept of homeostasis, what you're trying to do to get these adaptations is to stress homeostasis. And it has to be sufficient stress. So if you push it a little bit and your body can get back into homeostasis, your body goes, fine, I could handle that. If you get out of the range to where, as you're saying, to get back into homeostasis, or before the body can get back into homeostasis, damage is done to the body goes, that's not good. I wasn't able to maintain homeostasis, so I need to do something about that so that the next time I keep it within the ranges.
Yeah, and I want to come back to this idea of the scales, right? I really like how this plays out because you can load that scale, and you're loading one side with training or stress, and your body's loading the other side to bring you back into that balance, right? So what you want to do is you want to actively tip that scale so it's pretty low and your body's going to have to react. But if you throw so much on and that scale slams down onto the floor, that's when you've probably gone too far. So there's that sweet spot.
I agree. So it's this concept of challenge or stress. So as you said, it's tip the scale a little bit, but don't break it. You don't want the scale to fall over. And I actually think this is a good place. We got a great clip from Sepp Kuss that we've actually never put on the episode before, talking about this idea of don't destroy yourself in intervals. And you get this mindset of do a little bit of damage, but don't break the scales.
I guess going back a bit to like a single day within the block, for me, it's really, you don't want to feel shattered. I think you want to feel like, yeah, I could have pushed 10%, 20% more that day, but you need to also think about 2 days down the road, 2 weeks down the road, because a lot of the times, depending on the session or how long it is, just going a bit over, doing a bit more when you're on a good day, you can really feel it later on. So I'd say for me, it's keeping every day at its hardest, at 80% at the end of the day, where you still feel like you could, go out to dinner with with your friends or something and not have your head on the table falling asleep. And then for I guess at the end of let's say like a two week training block, I think the accumulation of all those days, days where you're training hard but you still feel like you have something extra, I think the accumulation of that by the end of the block, you should feel maybe 90% at the end of your limit, but still, most importantly, mentally fresh, but ready for a rest, I guess. But yeah, there's so many variables that depend on where you are in the training cycle, how close your nearest race is, things like that. I think in training, I focus quite a lot on the numbers, the power. Yeah, I'd say I study it quite a bit, and see how it is relative to what I've done in the past, or times on the climbs, power on similar climbs I've done before, how it's going to relate to the next race I'm doing, things like that. But yeah, I think in terms of the recovery aspect, I don't really yet, at least haven't bought into the kind of metrics they have now for recovery and things like that, measuring like if you're ready to train the next day, that kind of thing. I haven't really bought into yet for whatever reason. Maybe it's just the cycling in the moment is my numbers time and everything outside is not. But yeah, I think that would be a bit of information overload for me.
I'm really glad that Sepp brought up that concept, and I'm especially glad that it was a rider of his level, because this concept of not destroying yourself during intervals is important for everyone at all levels. And the reason for that is oftentimes we think of the workout just solely for itself, and we never worry about what tomorrow is, what later in the week is, what next week is, and all of those things become additive. So, forgetting everything else and blowing yourself up today, it's probably pushing yourself a little bit too hard. All of this talk of homeostasis is really leading to two great topics that we should talk about that are important to this, right? And that's going to be balance and timing and the combination, how they work together.
Rob, that was incredibly well said. It was almost as if we paused the episode and you wrote that.
Except I didn't read what I wrote, son. I told you, man, if I say it, it flies out of my head. If I write something down, I don't have to read it. It sticks there.
Is that the trick?
It's the trick.
Write it down?
You should write it down.
That's your balance.
I have a lot of things I got to write down.
I have a lot of tricks.
So when you look at all this, when you look at adaptation, when you look at the issues with this more is better concept, in the context of homeostasis, our body is trying to stay in homeostasis. This brings up two really important concepts to training, which is any good coach is really thinking about these when they're building a training plan, and that's balance and timing.
Right, because otherwise what we're doing is we're just throwing things. We're just load. And is that load appropriate in February? Is that load appropriate at the end of the week? Is that load appropriate when we have a race in 2 weeks? How do we use the stress? Where do we put the body slightly out of balance? Because if you put it out of balance too close to a race, it's not going to get itself back to homeostasis before that race comes in. Or if you do that too early in the season, great, it adapts and you're unbelievably fast. And this is where my expertise comes into the puzzle, but how long can you mentally keep yourself in that spot where you're willing to push the body, recover, all of those pieces of the puzzle. So how we do this and where we do this becomes really the art of coaching.
And I think that this balance concept, right, it is applying across the entire annual training plan, right? It doesn't mean symmetry. It doesn't mean constant. That's not what we're talking about with balance. It doesn't mean the same volume and the same intensity every single day, even though that looks very balanced in a chart. I actually love sort of stuff like this. I don't find beauty in symmetry, so to say. I find beauty in this sort of asymmetrical balance. And if you were to sort of graph out, and I wish that I could show you this in my mind, but maybe on the left side of your annual training plan, there's so much volume, but so little intensity, right? That is sort of one load. But on the right side, your volume is probably down, your intensity is probably up. Even though the graph almost sort of flips, there's still balance in there, even though it looks a little asymmetric if you just take one part.
Another really important thing to understand about balance is we have a lot of balances. So we've talked about the balance between stress and recovery. Rob just brought up balance between intensity and going easy. If all you're ever doing is going hard, that gets you out of balance. That starts breaking homeostasis. But if all you're ever doing is going easy, you're also going to be disappointed.
I think this takes us to the point where we have to look beyond just training, right? We have to look at the rest of our lives as well. We have to get in this place to say, what's going on with our work life? And this is incredibly important for masters athletes. And I think this is where people kind of miss the boat. We look at what pros are doing. Well, yeah, a pro goes for a 4-hour ride. They go home, they eat their recovery shake, they eat a meal, they sit on the couch, take a nap, they do whatever. I come home from a 4-hour ride and I've got 2 kids. And I've got to record a podcast with you 2 yokels, and then I've got to do this and I've got to do that. So how do we balance all of those pieces of the puzzle? That's incredibly important. And this brings us to timing too. When's the family vacation coming up? So how do we do the load leading into the family vacation? All of those pieces of the puzzle are incredibly important.
Yeah, and this is a really good place to bring in another clip from Dr. Sam Milan from episode 205, where he talks about that. He was focusing on recovery versus stressors, that balance, but brought in life. Mental stress is also a stressor, and you have to factor those in, and gets to this idea that if you have enough stressors in your life, 8 hours a week of training can actually push you into overtraining. So let's hear from him now.
Yeah, well, so as you said very well, we focus too much or the right amount of time, right, on training and bioenergetics and nutrition and different training zones, et cetera, right? But I think it's great, to focus also on recovery, which is an area that many times is overlooked by many people out there. And it's absolutely key because that recovery period is where you're going to simulate and supercompensate. And many of these metabolic stressors, they're elicited by training, they need to be completed in the recovery phase, right? We have to always, or I try always to keep in mind that training and competition is both physiological and metabolic and even mental stress on the body, right? And that's what's going to elicit multiple responses to improve. But again, without proper recovery, it is not going to be possible to optimize those stressors elicited by exercise. That's why recovery, it's a big deal. And at least, over all these 26 years working with athletes, to me, recovery and monitoring their recovery, because as we're going to speak about, recovery is not just go and take a nap or go to sleep 8 hours, right? There are many more areas, but this has been as big as training, to me at least.
So what would you say? I mean, a lot of our listeners obviously are not pros. They're not training 6 hours a week. And I've heard this from people where they'll say, I don't go out and do 6-hour rides. I don't train 30 hours a week. I'm just doing 1-2 hours. So it's stressful, but it's not that stressful on my body. My body can handle it. So I don't need to take recovery days. What would your response to them be?
Yeah, it's like, you're right. The response will be like, you can really get overtrained and fatigued even if you train only 6 hours a week or 7 hours a week. And I do it myself, right? Most of us are very busy with lots going on, and we try to squeeze in time from work or family or multiple things that we might be doing, and we might not be able to do more than 8 hours, right? But it is that our regular activities that might interfere with our training. So, it happens to me that, when I have, for example, a very stressful week or a very busy week, I might go out for an hour and a half ride and I'm dead, right? And that might be just my second day of the week. And so that's what I need. Like, well, how in the world I'm overtrained or fatigued, right? When I'm just doing an hour and a half, and last week I only trained 3 days or 4 days, and not over an hour and a half any of the days. So intuitively you think there's no way I'm overtrained or fatigued, but yes, you are, because you have so many stressors or so many things in life that are going to interfere with your exercise, that even a small dose of exercise can be difficult to overcome.
So this whole topic of balance that we've been going through, an important thing to remember is that balance is dynamic. It's not static. It's not just us standing with our 2 feet flat on the ground. It's almost like riding a balance board, right? That's rolling back and forth underneath you. As you're swaying, you're constantly finding that balance point. You're never standing completely still. But if you keep it sort of within the bounds, you can always pull it back. Lean too far, let that board get too far away from you, and suddenly it shoots out from underneath. And that's a concept that Bennett talked about back in episode 82 when he was talking about needing to push to the edge. And if you go too far, everything goes wrong.
Yeah, I think from my experience of applying heavy loads of training to the body, whether it be in training or in racing, is that the immune system is deeply, deeply rooted in that process and that response. And, without a doubt, there's this breakdown and vulnerability that I feel like does occur with the immune system. And often during those periods of heavy race or training load, it's like I'm really riding that razor wire of being so close to being sick or falling apart, but also just about in really, really good condition, really in top form. And I think the signals and signs, can be confusing. I think if I just look at one of the most recent races I've done this spring in Triano Adriatico, that was without a doubt, the biggest load that I've had in my body up to this point in the year. And by the end of the race, I felt like I was almost getting sick. I had muscle soreness that was so much more intense. I was a little achy. My stomach I was kind of acidic and heartburny and not really working right, but didn't really feel like I was sick. And then, do the travel home, get in the airport, expose myself to who knows what viruses and bacteria on the way home. And then the next day I'm, full blown gastro bug, puking and aching and just really a mess. So I think that's a good example of it. And we see that time and time again. And it's something that needs to be definitely respected in the process. And, another reason to have a coach and a pilot and someone that's going to oversee your progression so you can control the controllables as much as you can during those training phases.
So you're saying often they go hand in hand where you're coming onto really good form and you feel those symptoms of being sick. Do you find there's a line? Do you know when to say, okay, I've done enough. I shouldn't do any more here?
Yeah, it's a fine line. Like I said, there's a line, but it's blurry and it's vague and gray and confusing. I think, most of us as athletes, we're committed and we're focused and we're ambitious. And the last thing you want to do is void or stop that progression. It's almost like an addiction. You get into a training cycle and you're just sort of, manically just chewing through the training and looking to the next day, looking to the next day, looking to the next day. And the worst thing that I can fathom is stopping that progression or having a little hiccup or road bump. And, if I get a little perspective from someone outside the situation, they'll be like, well, of course, rein it back a day. Let's pull it in, take a day easy. What are you going to lose in a day? And logically and methodically, it makes a lot of sense. But the component of an athlete that makes us good a lot of times is the same one that helps us prohibits us from letting go and detaching and sort of stopping that. So there's a line, and finding that is a bit of the art, I guess, of training and the art of staying health and finding that sort of magical peak condition that we're always looking for.
But you're saying there's no magical formula for finding that balance, and it's sometimes hard for athletes to recognize it because the nature of being a good athlete makes you want to push through it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, there's no magic formula, and I don't believe there's any training graph number that can tell you that. I think, like I said, that it really is that is sort of the art and the mastery of training and the pursuit of performance excellence. That's something. I've been doing this for a long time now. This is my 12th year racing as a professional, and I still don't have this mastered. And this is something I'm doing full time every day. It's part of that pursuit and that pursuit of mastery in the training and the preparation and the execution of performance that is just something that has to be continually worked on and honed in as best you can.
Listeners, we hope that you have enjoyed today's conversation on balancing high and low intensity. For more on high-intensity training, easy rides, and recovery, visit fasttalklabs.com. We offer dozens of articles and videos on training zones, recovery techniques, and an entire deep dive pathway on cycling interval training. Take a look at fasttalklabs.com.
So this brings us back to something that's really important for me that I would like to discuss, because I think a lot of people struggle with this. This is, if you think of one place where people really get into that more is better mentality, it's that high intensity work, that HIIT work. If I'm just doing 2 interval sessions a week, that's good. But if I do 4 a week, if I do 5 a week, that's really, really good. And that's where I think you're taking that one side of the scale and just pulling it down and pulling it down. And if you keep doing that, eventually it's just going to take the whole scale down. So that is why we're always saying, yeah, you need that HIIT work. It's a really powerful stressor. A single workout's going to stress that homeostasis. But this is where you need to have that balance. You need to pull the scale down, use some HIIT work to do that. But then you need that easy riding. Then you need that recovery to let the scale come back up, to let the body get back into homeostasis.
Yeah, I think this is a really important piece because, I mean, all of us in this room are different coaches, right? We're going to tend towards different things.
I'm not a coach.
The two of us that are coaches in this room can be very different.
And the one who likes to read about this stuff out loud.
So the point here is that, you know, there's a bunch of different ways to go at this. Obviously, you have people that are more sweet spot inclined or a little bit more volume inclined. I happen to be more of an intensity inclined coach. It's just who I am. But this is where it's so important to make sure that the recovery days are built in. And then as an athlete, having an understanding of what your coach is trying to do, so that if there's an interval session Tuesday and then a longer kind of interval style session Wednesday, and you've got an easy ride in the schedule on Thursday, you need to go easy. You need to really pay attention to what the limits are. I've made jokes a lot. People go, do I need a power meter? And I said, yes, you need a power meter, but I want that power meter more for the easy days than what you're doing on the hard days. Because here's your ceiling, right? Keep it below that.
Yeah. You know, and I think that this concept, Grant, like you're talking about, things work within a system because they're balanced within that system. And, you know, I can think of an example. A few years back, I was working with a top American cyclist who had some success previously, a lot of success, in fact, best in the country. But they were losing it and scrambling to try to get that back. And they were consulting with a lot of different people and trying to take parts of one person and combine it with parts of a different plan. And it just wasn't working because it doesn't work that way. Your high intensity sort of program, Grant, can work when it's balanced within your system, but try to take Grant's high intensity workouts and put them into Trevor's, you know, program. Maybe that's not balanced. Maybe that doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's so important to really understand what your coach is trying to do and make sure that that fits with what you want to do. Yeah. And I mean, you've got to believe in it and you've got to buy into it. Because then it's really easy to get on that easy day and just, put no pressure on the pedals. Like I always joke that I can't believe people don't enjoy easy days. It's awesome. You're outside, you're doing 80 watts and looking at the mountains. Roll with it, man.
The biggest feedback I get on easy days is, what is the value of those? I don't get it. I'm not doing anything stressful. And I agree. On an easy ride, you are not stressing homeostasis. So the issue is looking at that out of context. So it's, again, talking about these scales. Yes, if all you ever do is go out and do easy 1 hour rides, you're not going to be a very fit athlete.
Absolutely.
Think about these scales. You do that high intensity work. You do that big hard work that really stresses. It pushes the one side of the scale down. That easy ride is what helps bring the scale back up. You need that push and pull of the two. And that's where the easy ride is really valuable. If you're not doing that HIIT work and all you're doing is easy ride, I agree. you're not winning any races. You're not going to get very fit. You have to look at the two together, and they are pushing and pulling that scale.
And for clarity, I just want to make sure when you guys are saying easy rides, you're not talking about 3 hours of base. You're talking about more of an active recovery ride.
Right.
It's short. The workload is low. Maybe you could have just sat on the couch instead. That's what you're saying with easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like just really barely turning over the pedals. I mean, I've got guys that'll go for 90 minutes and they've got a 20 TSS at the end of that 90 minutes. Like that's impressive on the other side of the scale.
Right. So I love where I have one day, you go out, you do a 2-hour ride, you get 120 TSS. Go out the next day, you do an hour and a half ride, and you get the 25 TSS.
Yeah, so it's all about this balance, right? You can't do too much HIIT, but you also have to work in the recovery.
Yep. And this is a great place to throw in a quote from Ruth, who really talks about exactly what we're talking about. Don't do too much HIIT work and the value of recovery.
Definitely changes throughout the season. So right now we're in the off season and I'm not really doing any high intensity, which is quite nice. Today I went for a nice long bike ride and went really slow the whole time. So I didn't really go very far, but it was still a nice day for it. And then kind of towards racing, once we get closer to racing, probably, in the middle of the racing season, you're getting a lot of your intensity from racing itself. So then outside of that, maybe I do 1 or 2 sessions a week kind of a thing, which feels like just enough for me.
And are you careful about that? Or would you, every time you're on the bike during the season, would you be going hard? Or is it important to get those easy days?
No, it's very important to get easy days, which took me a while to learn. I think while I was younger, I would always just feel like I had to be going really hard whenever I got on my bike. And now in my old age, I've appreciated my really slow rides. I know that it's okay. Like sometimes you panic that you're not going hard or pushing hard on the pedals all the time. But especially in the race season, you're getting so much intensity in racing that it's okay to just continue your pace and just chill a little bit mentally and physically.
So Rob, you raised a really good point earlier about we are not talking about the 3-hour ride. So that's an endurance ride. That's not a recovery ride. And I do think it's important to bring up that is another type of balance, the HIIT work versus those longer, slow rides, because they do both hit your aerobic system. They both train and produce adaptations in your aerobic systems, but their stressors are different. They tip the scale differently. And there is a fair amount of research showing that they are additive, that just doing one or the other will bring about some adaptations, but won't get you to where you want to get to. It's when you combine those two that you get that best stressor on homeostasis to produce the best adaptations.
Yeah, we always have to go back to that concept of energy systems. Trevor and I, you and I both love that one. And hitting both of those energy systems is really important. I think that people tend to fall into this traditional sort of training method, right? Where you stress the anaerobic energy system maybe twice a week, you get some medium duration rides, and then maybe a long duration ride each week. And that is very balanced between the two different energy systems. Both are getting their due. But, me going back to sort of my asymmetric nature in the preparation period, especially before the season, I love to shake that up a little bit. And maybe in a full week period, you're doing sort of 3 on weeks and a recovery week. If you're doing 2 high intensity sessions a week for 3 weeks, that's 6 total. I almost like to do a block periodization where that first week is maybe 5 days out of 7 of high intensity. Now, because of balance, you can't do every one as hard as you would have if you were only doing 2 a week. You got to dial it back a little bit because tomorrow you're going to get kicked in the butt too. But I love to pull all of those to the front of the week. You deplete some glycogen, you really give a big stimulus, but because of balance, your remaining weeks, then you're pulling the intensity out of those, right? And you're just sort of focusing on base. So even though we're hitting both of these energy systems, there's more than one way to sort of balance those out in our training.
Yeah, and that's a really cool thing to kind of bring up because this happens naturally for a lot of high-level cyclists with small tours early in the season, right? They have a 7-day tour. There's a ton of load. And then what do they do? And I think this is a misconception. Like, what do? Well, they go right back to training. No, most of them just get on their bike and kind of noodle for 3 or 4 days. They're going to still get in time because otherwise their legs are going to lock up, but they're going to just kind of noodle around. But I want to take that one step further. We've talked a lot in this segment about HIIT and what the intensity does as a stressor. But we also have to touch base on what volume does as a stressor. And like we're talking about more is not better. This is the place that I started the episode off with of what we grew up with in the 80s and 90s was more volume, more volume, more volume. Get on your bike and do more. We had these stories of people spending 7, 8, 9 hours a day on the bike. And I mean, the stories from swimming are obnoxious. Those guys were doing 5 hours a day in the pool, and it turned up and it worked for a little while. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind too is that volume is also a stressor, and we have to be careful about how we're using volume as a stressor. Just like you can't go do with regularity 6 HIIT workouts in a week, you also are got to watch yourself when you're doing 4-hour day after 4-hour day after 4-hour day after 4-hour day. That's going to tax you as well.
I take total exception. My 6-day, 40-hour training camp was a brilliant idea. 2 months later, when I came out of my overtraining, I was flying.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Yeah, Grant, this year I think demonstrated this concept for me a lot. I had a lot going on, a lot of stress, everything, and family, the end of COVID. Maybe that was an inaccurate statement, but
End-ish
of COVID. Anyway, we digress. I did almost no intensity from like October, November until like yesterday. And it has, in some regard, kind of destroyed my fitness, right? I ultimately lost so much. Maybe for me, it was the right thing because of the balance and everything in my life that was going on. Maybe doing all of that intensity I should have been doing could have pushed me over the edge. So I do think it was the right choice. But man, it ravaged my fitness.
So let's address timing from, again, this concept of homeostasis. And I want to bring up something. I'm interested in how the two of you respond to this. But what I believe is if we want to get to our absolute highest level, to our best fitness, we actually have to have a period where we get out of homeostasis a little bit and we stay there. We put our bodies in a bit of an emergency mode, and there's an evolutionary basis behind this. If we're doing a whole lot of work, our body's going, something's going on. I'm in danger. So I need to forget about trying to stay perfectly in balance and basically give you that little bit extra so that you can stay alive. So I think of it like a NOS button. And to give you an example, one of the adaptations that we see to high intensity work is an increase in your blood volume. So your body can very quickly increase the blood volume. That improves how much blood gets pumped per beat of your heart. So that's your stroke volume. And that gives you a little more of an aerobic adaptation. Your body can maintain that for a bit, but it doesn't like keeping the blood volume high. At some point, it's going to say, I've been out of homeostasis for too long. I need to get back into balance. So you can do that. You can sustain it for a little bit, but eventually you're going to have to pay the piper. So that's why I think timing is critical, because if you push this a little bit above homeostasis, so I think of it like hitting that NOS button. If you're doing that in December, you're going to be struggling by the time the season even starts.
Right, unless you want to be incredible in December. Like what we were talking about earlier is that idea of it's work to maintain homeostasis, right? So it's work for your body to increase the blood volume. It's got to give something else up somewhere, and it can't do that forever. But this is why we want to do road with our cross riders. I want to take a cross rider and put them in a 6-day stage race. I want to put them in a block like this where, hey, training's one thing. I can push you in training, but you might still be looking at me with one eyebrow cocked and going, I'm not going all in today. But if I put you in a race setting, you're going all in, right? So that's something we played around with a lot this year and a little bit last year, that load. And then, okay, unload. Your body went to a whole new place. Like you said with that NOS button, it knows it can go there now. And again, we're anthropomorphizing, but like it quote unquote knows it can go there now. So you got this whole extra gear. So that's a really cool way to look at it. Just like supercharge it for a little bit. But then when are you supercharging it?
Right.
And then how are you coming back to homeostasis after you supercharge it?
Yeah, the other thing to really consider here is the only way that you can surge is if you're in a good place to begin with. And oftentimes I love to compare things outside of this world because it is a little easier to understand. So if you're going through your everyday work life and you're at 75%, you're happy, you're productive, things are going really well, a big project comes in, sure, you can surge and you can meet that demand, you can do it well, you can be productive, the quality of your work is really high. But if week in and week out, you're operating at 100% effectiveness and productivity at work, anytime you need to surge and get better, it's not there. Or if you do, it breaks you, right? And so we bring that back into training. If you're constantly in a surge, you're not actually in a surge. You're just over pushing yourself.
Right.
So a surge only happens when everything is in a good spot. And then you can do the things you need to reach that peak, that next level.
Yep. I think this is a great place to bring in actually a good quote from Tim Cusick from episode 119, where he talks about this in terms of a CTL, which, we've discussed CTL before, and I think it has a great value. But again, this is where timing is really critical. Getting your CTL really high, everybody thinks that is the goal. I'm going to say with timing, it's getting your CTL to the right level at the right time. So when we talk about homeostasis, you might be in homeostasis at, say, a 70, 80 CTL. If you take it up to 100, that's that revving it up. That's that getting the body a little above homeostasis that you can sustain for a little bit of time. So you need to time that CTL, and that's what Tim really dives into in this quote. So let's hear from him.
Most of my focus is on the CTL progression. How are they accumulating over time? Specifically, I have a system of kind of plateau and overload. People look at periodization of these numbers. You could put that idea into periodization. I think when we're looking at CTL growing, there's only so long you can grow CTL. You can keep accumulating training load and expect improved performance out of an athlete. And there's only so long you can sit at a CTL plateau and expect an athlete to hold a level of performance. So I think when you start thinking about this idea of training stress score, of scoring these in some external training load process, it really is about understanding the progression of that training load. That's the science that's giving me ability to make better decisions. But I have to color in the content underneath that, how we're gaining it. That is an art form. I mean, I have some specific techniques. I bet Trevor has some specific techniques to that. For me, when I'm thinking about it, I guess so CTL is not a prescription, and people need to really wrap their heads around that. You can put out some generalized numbers, and I can give you some, right? An athlete, once they get in the, 70 to 80 range, tend to be getting, and assuming the training content is good, not perfect, doesn't have to be perfect, but good, they're probably going to have a performance improvement in that range. They'll have another one in the 100 to 120 range of CTL. It really depends on the content and what they're doing. And then for the elite athlete, you might see another around 140, 145 and above. So you could put some generalized thinking to that, but that's not a prescription. That doesn't mean, let me just put an athlete on the bike, gain to those levels, just ride, don't worry about what you're doing, just gather TSS and you're going to be great. That's just some kind of numbers to shoot for. For me, it really is about building a purposeful training strategy, understanding the ability of the rider and the demands of the event, building content based off that, right? So first you build the workouts, then you understand the weeks, then you understand the months, the 4-week cycles, the 3-week cycles, whatever you're using. Then once you get a good grip of all that, then for me, what I do in planning, then I backfill in TSS. And then I'll tweak that plan to make sure that the training load is plateaued or overloading in the time phases that I want them to work in. Then when the training actually occurs, I'm measuring that CTL, ATL growth to what I had put within the training plan. So I know that's a long answer, but that's how I use it.
Tim is definitely an expert on the training peaks side of things. And I think that this concept of having the right CTL is important. We've been talking about how do you balance the overall training load, right? And getting yourself to that good place to surge. But another thing that we really need to be balancing in timing is when we do that high intensity work. And I remember listening to a great quote with Larry Warbase from, episode 124, where he was talking about Cadell Evans and how he was avoiding intensity or in an early season training camp because he understood his body. And when he poured that on, he came into form really quickly. He wanted to make sure that he was able to do that, being, who he was at the right time of the season. Let's listen to Larry tell us his story.
I definitely think it's pretty individual. It's like, I guess now I think back, like I remember when I'd be going to the camps with BMC and we'd go and Cadell would just ride. He'd never do any intervals. He'd just ride, he'd just ride his own pace. He'd go slow up the climbs, let everyone else go do their efforts, whatever, and he'd just ride, And I remember being like, how is this guy so good when he doesn't do any of the intervals, And everyone was like, asking the same question, like, how can Cadell just not even do any efforts? Like, I don't understand. And then I was like, the young guy. So I was like, well, I'll just ask him, like everyone else was too scared to ask him. So I asked him like, hey, Cadell, like, how come you don't do any of the efforts? Like, why do you just ride? And he said, well, like I know over the course of the years, my coach and I have figured out that like, it really takes me a short amount of time to get really fit. And I can only hold that fitness for a certain amount of time. So he said, I'd rather just ride here and wait till it gets closer to my objectives. And that's when I'll really start training hard because I don't want to be too fit too soon and then, lose that before my important objectives. And I was like, okay, well, that's a pretty fair and good answer. So, I think it is different for everyone. And I guess for me, it's really hard to say. I guess I'm not as dialed in as someone like he was. So I think everyone's different though. And I think pretty much it's just trial and error of figuring out, how it is. But I think if I was an amateur, I wouldn't even be stressed about having only a month to train before my first races. If I was really, really gunning, then, I think 2 months would be plenty of time and 3 months would be awesome, and then from there on, you can just keep going, I think. So I think the other important thing, and this is one thing I've applied the last couple of years, is just to have good breaks in the season too. So if I'm starting to get tired, I'll just take 3 to 5 days totally off the bike, won't touch the bike. And for me, that's huge because it totally like resets you, refreshes you, and you really don't lose like any fitness.
So going back, you said 1 to 2 months or 3 months would be great. Are you talking about when you start doing your intensity, get ready for races, or are you talking more about the basics?
No, that's just riding in general. That's just starting up. Ideally you would have like 1 to 2 months to just ride, and then, maybe, I guess, first month ride, second month do some zone 3 stuff, third month do high intensity. I'll go through these mini cycles over the course of the year, and you can add some high intensity in there just before your first races, but not exactly peak for your first races, just so you can at least compete. And then your really big goals, whenever those are, I guess, then have the really full build before that. I think the biggest error is just overtraining. I've seen guys do any different kind of training. Like, I'm someone who believes really like there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat, or whatever the saying is. So I've seen guys who never even do over zone 3 in training, and then they can go to a race and they're incredible. And then, or you see one guy who does massive volume, one guy who does like the least amount of volume you've ever seen, and they all somehow perform well. And so I think everyone is different, but I think the one place where I see a lot of people make the same mistakes is just overtraining, and not taking enough recovery. And like these guys who will just absolutely train the house down, and they get to the races and then they're just too tired. And that's even I'll see guys coming off the off season, overtrained because they trained so hard in the winter because they were so motivated to be good. That happens to a lot of guys. Or they'll be flying for the first race or two and then they just die. And it happens to a lot of professionals. And these are guys who have, some of the top coaches in the world. So I think that's something to be really conscious of, just not doing too much.
That's such a great point about how you need to know individually what you can do and how that works. And you got to be careful about everybody around you, right? You can't pour into, well, they're doing a ton of intensity, I'm just going to jump into that. Where does it work for you? How does it work for you? Because understanding that intensity, it comes on quick. And I'll use it throughout the course of the year, but how I'm going to use that is different in February than how I'm going to use that when we're prepping somebody to be racing in a month or racing in a week. And so there might be more repeats. There might be less recovery the day after. It might go into a second HIIT workout. It might go into a base ride the next day. All of those pieces of the puzzle are really important because that high intensity stuff, I don't want to use the NOS example because you already used it, right? But it's like caffeine. It's like caffeine for your training. You give you a little caffeine, you go to that next level, you're ready to go. I'm amped up, I'm ready to go. But we've all over-caffeinated.
I'm over-caffeinated right now.
We've been talking about your latte this whole episode. But yeah, we've all over-caffeinated and gotten that spot where it's too much and we're over the edge, right? So we've been talking about this whole episode, and Seiler's got so many great quotes, but he's got this one thing where he talks about intensity as fresh fruit. And I think he talked about it in episode 141. It's quick, but it doesn't last. So let's listen to Dr. Seiler talk about that.
Grant, that was great. Did you write that down?
Somebody else wrote it down, but I didn't read it.
Okay. Let's hear from Dr. Seiler and this metaphor of fresh fruit.
I often talk about fresh fruit and, software, hardware. A lot of athletes are interested in their anaerobic capacity, their lactate tolerance, and they do these super high intensity intervals. And you do get adaptations. If you haven't been doing these, 30-15s or some kind of a really high intensity interval training, then a little bit of that will improve your anaerobic capacity. I know it will. And the thing about it is, though, it only takes a few weeks. You can get a big improvement, a 10% improvement or so in like 4 workouts, if they're well executed, but they're costly and they're fresh fruit because that adaptation is what I would call a soft adaptation. It's some proteins in your blood and in the intracellular space. It's some changes in buffering. It's stuff that both comes pretty fast, but it goes away pretty fast. And it's really costly to maintain, because you have to do these really high intensity efforts that cause a big stress response in order to get those soft adaptations. So we're going to time that training. We're not going to do that at times of the season when we don't need that little turbo, if that makes sense. And so this is about being the chess player and knowing when to play put your players in different position on the board and when to emphasize your basics and when to bring in a little bit of that top end work that is costly, but that results in relatively fast adaptations, but also, what should I say, they will also deteriorate more rapidly. Whereas that long haul stuff, the low intensity, the volume, those adaptations, research shows us that with detraining, they are maintained longer. Capillary density and so forth like that. It seems it's like it's infrastructure that's been built. The lattice work in the cells has been built, and it doesn't decay as quickly as those soft adaptations.
So I think with these two quotes from both Dr. Seiler and from Larry Warbus, we're getting at the answer to a question I get asked a lot, which is, why shouldn't I be doing a ton of high intensity in December? Doesn't that give me a leg up in the season? And this is, you have to think both about that balance side that we were just talking about and this timing side. If you were doing a ton of high intensity work in December, you're going to start pushing that edge of the homeostasis. You're going to start tipping that one side of the scale and not letting it come back up. And then you're on a timeline, then you're on a limit. And all you're doing is just making sure your season happens really early. Hope there's some early season races. And then you're going to have to hit a rest, possibly when you actually think you want to be on race form. And that's why.
Yeah, we always need to remember and consider that doesn't mean no high intensity early in the season. Right. It just means it's not a focus, right? Because again, energy systems. We want to train things. We don't want to forget about them. But if we fast forward to when somebody is peaking, a very common thing with peaking in the 2 weeks before an event, pull back that volume, increase the high intensity, ramp up that fitness and form really quickly before the event, maintain it for a day or two, come back off.
And this is where we want to come into that idea of what does our life look like as we go through periods of time. And I've said this before on Fast Talk, and I'll say it again. We're talking to a lot of masters athletes here. We're talking to a lot of people that are training with full-time jobs or with families or with things like that. So when's the family vacation? What are the kids going to do over spring break? And I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that are like, oh, spring break's coming up. I'm going to have 40 hours to train that week. And on the back of my mind, I'm going, what are your kids going to be doing during that? And then the week after that, well, I didn't do anything. I don't know what happened. This kid got sick. This happened. All these things go on. So balancing your season, yeah, you might want to hit like a be on form briefly because you know you're going to come off form with a vacation. So maybe you got to go find a race in February that you're going to go do because you've got spring break coming up. And then it's another build back up. So that timing is different, literally not just for people's different race schedules, but for their life schedules. And so we have to figure out that balance and that timing for each individual person.
Grant, for your family vacations, do you train up for the increased right arm fly casting volume that you suddenly take on?
And well, I don't train my upper body most of the rest of the year. So that's the thing, like load the legs. And then I'm just going to go sit in the river, ice the legs for a week, ice the left hand with a beer for a week, and fly fish with the right. It's perfect.
It's perfect.
So I'm actually going to do something I've never done on this show before, which is I'm going to talk about an athlete that two of us in this room have coached. So I had this athlete I worked with for several years who started as a road cyclist and then started doing cross as kind of a fun thing and has been more and more shifting towards cross to where now that is all he does. That is his focus.
Good choice.
So I actually said, you have hit a level where you need a cross-specific coach, and this year handed him off to Grant. All the years I had coached him, he was doing both a road season and a cross season. So a lot of my coaching was just trying to figure out how to get him through a very long season. This year, he's just doing cross. So Grant started working with him, and I noticed in January, you had him doing a ton of functional work. You had him on the bike. He wasn't doing high volume. And he actually emailed me. He's like, I don't get this. I can count the minutes of high intensity work I've done in January. And my response to him was, when does your season start? Well, August. I'm like, so why would you be doing high intensity now? Grant is actually doing a lot of functional, doing a ton of off the bike work with him, a ton of functional work with you to get you healthy, to get your body ready. So when the time comes, you can handle the high intensity he's going to throw at you.
Well, Grant, your first challenge is to teach him that the cross season doesn't really start until October.
It doesn't start until quote unquote cross weather. We're not going there. We can do a whole episode on that. But yeah, and then oddly enough, one of the other things that he went to next was to do a bunch of intensity come February and March just to raise his ceilings, just to get him into those places where he became a really spiky athlete again. Because when he's a road athlete, you need to be sustained. You need to be able to do that for a long time. And I like to think we're in an off season. We're going to be able to recover. I can challenge you. I can tax you a little bit, and I don't have to worry about an April race. So there's a whole lot of pieces of this puzzle that go on, and there's a lot of variables that aren't necessarily thought of for who you are and what you want to be able to do.
And I think this is a great place to throw in our final quote for the day, which is also a Dr. Seiler quote, where he gets into what you're talking about, which is the pieces of the puzzle. You have to look at the whole season. You have to look at the whole year, not individual workouts, and see how it all fits together. So let's hear from Dr. Seiler.
They give us some representative prescriptions. And so it's really important for me to say there's nothing magical about any of these. And I'm not trying to sell one. Some would say, well, Steven sells the 4x8. That's the Seiler intervals or whatever. No, 4x8 was one of the models we've used, and it seemed to result in good adaptation, but it maybe could have been 7x6 or, I'm saying? We think it's more to do with the total duration. that we're prescribing, that actually is a constraining factor that we can use as coaches, or, to prescribe and help our athlete be where we want them to be, is what's the total number of minutes that I want them to be working, accumulating work at this intensity. And then I need to back up now, because we get so focused on the individual interval session that we forget the forest here. We get so focused on the tree that we forget the forest. And the forest is this. Let's say you train 5 times a week on average, week in, week out. So that's about 250 sessions per year, if my math is right, plus minus. And let's say you do an 80-20 model where you say, yep, 20% of my sessions are going to be seriously hard. All right, then that's around 50 HIIT sessions each year. And now you may end up doing a few more than that, but a minimum, typical listeners are doing 50 to 100 hard sessions per season or per year as part of their training, right? So what we have to think about is, when we're prescribing this, we're trying to prescribe an interval training prescription base that gives us the signals that we need over time, over these 100 sessions that they may be, without stressing more than necessary. So I always get back to this issue is I want to create a signal. I've got to live with some stress. Yes, we're going to stress the system big time, but we don't need to stress the system more than necessary. Then it becomes unsustainable. This is about the big philosophy. This is the big picture. And sometimes we forget this because we get so focused on the individual details of the workout that maybe are not as important as we think. And we forget the big issue, which is, hey, I need to make sure that these 100 hard workouts I do in a year have some, there's a plan here, and that there's a sustainability built into them so that I'm progressing. I'm not biting off more than I can chew. So that is part of the big picture that needs to really be, for me, that's the foundation for everything that I'm trying to prescribe. If I'm working with my daughter, who I love dearly, I don't want her to become overtrained or fall apart. I want what's best for her.
So I think we're getting to the point where we need to start wrapping up this episode. So let's take our take-home concept, but use it to give some practical recommendations of what all this means and how we feel our listeners should take these concepts and balance and timing and apply it to their training. So who'd like to go first?
All right. Well, I gotta
hold on. Rob's got to write down his answer. Need a little more time there, Rob? I'm getting the look of death. Okay, Grant.
Anyway, I'll go ahead. Gonna give me something to think about other than his deaths there. But I think a good way to get a little practical advice here is one of the things I tell a lot of my athletes at whatever level they're at. Map out your life first. Map out what you want the season to look like first, and then build the training around that. Instead of, here's the idyllic training situation, let me try to fit my life into this. And what I mean by that, hey man, life might be this big stage race you have in Europe. Life might be, I'm going to have a baby born in this month. Life might be a wedding. Life might be vacations. It might be all of those things, but those are the bedrock. That's the stuff that we're going to work around. That's the stuff that the timing becomes so important for. And if we build this beautiful periodized training plan and then say, oh, well, but I got to go on vacation in March. Okay, well, that changes everything because the timing changes and the balance changes. Or, Wednesdays are a really hard time for me to get 3 hours in because I have this. All right, well, that changes the balance. So map the life out first, and then let's build the training in upon that. And that's not just true of somebody who's got a really busy, that's true of professionals too.
For me, it goes back to that dynamic balance concept because, I keep a balance board, a rolling balance board in the living room, and my kids and I love to play on it. And when you're doing that, you can feel the shift. You know when you're sliding to the right. You know when you're sliding to the left. And so I want everybody, my practical take home is this. Everybody really needs to be cognizant of how they're feeling, of what they're observing in their training, because you should feel the dynamic balance. You should feel that at times things are hard and that at times things are easy. If you can't feel the contrast between the two of those, then you're either going too easy all the time or you're going too hard all the time. You're being too monotonous, right? So feel that shifting back and forth.
So I'm going to continue with what Rob is saying, because I loved his analogy of the scale, and that it is a dynamic scale, and to adapt. And so remember, what we're ultimately trying to get is adaptation. To adapt, we need to stress homeostasis. So that's taking one side of the scale and pushing it down a little bit. But think of this scale as it has a very narrow base, and if you push too hard, the whole scale is going to fall over. You don't want to do that. So you want to push down one side of the scale, then let it come back up. Then push it down again and let it come back up. And whether you are working with a coach, whether you are training yourself, whether you have a plan or you make it up as you go, this is how you improve your level. This is how you adapt. Push the scale down a little bit, let it come back. Push it down again, let it come back. And you got to push enough that homeostasis is stressed, but not so much that the whole scale falls over. That's training in a nutshell.
That was another episode of Fast Talk where Grant and I tried to fill Chris Case's shoes. Subscribe to Fast Talk wherever you prefer to find your favorite podcasts. Be sure to leave us a rating and a review. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. As always, we love your feedback. Join the conversation at forums.fasttalklabs.com to discuss each and every episode. Become a member of the Fast Talk Laboratories at fasttalklabs.com/join and become a part of our education and coaching community. For the unbalanced Canadian living in America,
hey, that wasn't in the written part.
Trevor Connor.
Stop ad-libbing.
The work-life balanced Grant Holicky. I'm the lose my balance on the mountain bike, Rob Pickels. Thanks for listening.